Okay, we will be starting out today with Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Chris Newby. Fun. Okay. In 1968, there was a sudden outbreak of 3 unusual tick-borne diseases that sickened people living around Long Island Sound, an estuary of the Atlantic Ocean off the shores of New York and Connecticut. One of these diseases was Lyme arthritis, first documented near the township of Lyme, Connecticut. The other 2 were Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a bacterial disease, and babesiosis, a disease caused by a malaria-like parasite. The investigation into these outbreaks were fragmented among multiple state health departments, universities, and government labs. It's not clear if any officials were looking at the big picture, asking why these strange diseases had appeared seemingly out of nowhere in the same place and at the same time. 13 years later, in 1981, a Swiss-American tick expert named Willy was the first to identify the corkscrew-shaped bacterium that caused the condition that we now call Lyme disease. The discovery made headlines around the world and earned Bergdorfer a place in the medical history books. As researchers, the world over rushed back to their laboratories to learn as much as they could about this new organism. The 2 other disease outbreaks were all but forgotten. 38 years later, the conventional media establishment would like us to believe that it has a solid understanding of the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of Lyme disease. It says that the tests to detect Lyme are reliable, and that the disease can be cured with a few weeks of antibiotics. The statistics show a different reality. Reported cases of Lyme disease have quadrupled in the United States since the 1990s. In 2017, there were 42,743 cases of Lyme disease reported to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The scientists at the CDC who study the spread of disease now say the actual cases may be 10 times higher than reported, or 427,430 cases. On average, this means that there are about 1,000 new Lyme cases in the United States per day. While most Lyme disease patients who are diagnosed and treated early can fully recover, 10 to 20% suffer from persistent symptoms, some seriously disabling. One study estimates that Lyme disease costs about $1.3 billion each year in direct medical costs alone, but no one has assessed the full economic and societal impact of chronic Lyme, sometimes called post-treatment Lyme disease syndromes, or PTLDS, post-traumatic Lyme disease syndrome. Patients with lingering symptoms are often dismissed by the medical establishment, a situation that focuses them to seek unproven treatments that aren't covered by medical insurance. Many are unable to work or go to school. Some go bankrupt. Families break up. There's a high rate of suicide among Lyme disease patients, reflected in a common saying among the afflicted: Lyme doesn't kill you, it only makes you wish you were dead. The chasm between the researchers say they know about Lyme disease and what the chronically ill patients say they are experiencing has remained an open wound for decades. This book begins with the premise that both sides are mostly right, and that the main issue is that we are viewing this public health crisis too narrowly through lime-colored glasses. Before I started this book, I thought I had a solid understanding of the Lyme disease problem. As a former Lyme sufferer, I had firsthand experience with the disease and how the medical system fails patients. As a researcher for the Lyme documentary Under Our Skin, I had investigated the politics, money, and human impact of the disease. And as a writer at the medical school working in a group that teaches scientists how to conduct unbiased research, I was familiar with the fault lines in our current medical system that can compromise scientific objectivity. It took the late, great Willy to teach me how to view the problem through a wider lens, through a secret history of the Cold War, when Willy and others turned ticks into weapons of war. Chapter 1, Bitten, of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, 2002. Ticks may be a disease-carrying menace for hikers and pets, but they're also masters of survival. The parasites were sucking the blood of dinosaurs 99 million years ago, according to a set of amber fossils from Myanmar. Science Magazine, December 12, 2017. A tiny eight-legged creature slowly crept up a blade of beach grass. It was about the size of a poppy seed, armored with a hard, tiny shell. When it reached the blade's tip, the rear legs clamped down and the creature raised its forelegs high and wide toward the sky. It was blind and it experienced the world through these forelegs. There are a few sensory bristles perfected over more than 120 million years of evolution. Hold on, excuse me. There are a few sensory bristles perfected over more than 120 million years of evolution. Could detect temperature changes, humidity, ammonia in sweat, and carbon dioxide in breath. The tick was sniffing the air for these signals, waiting for a warm-blooded animal to pass by. It could wait hours, days, or even months, swaying with the sea breeze. I climbed out of a cobalt blue sailboat and onto a misty beach in Nashawina Island, located across the channel from Martha's Vineyard, followed by my husband, Paul, and our two sons, 10 and 12 years old. The boys ran off to play in the surf, while Paul and I walked down a sandy beach to look around the small island of 13 square miles, population 10. We saw an old military gun mount and a cowherd's cottage, where two rust-colored Scottish Highland cows, dull-dyed and mangy, stood at the edge of a soupy, algae-filled pond. We walked back to the beach to eat a picnic lunch with the boys, and I looked over as Paul, slim and fit, with big brown eyes and few strands of silver woven throughout his dark hair. He was relaxed as I had seen him in a long time. The Silicon Valley startup where he worked had recently gone public, and we had enough stock options to finally feel some financial relief. We couldn't have to sweat the monthly cash flows, and possibly had enough put aside to cover the boys' college tuition. After this vacation, I was going to ramp down my consulting business and try my hand as a full-time writer. I just won 2 national writing contests, and the kids were doing well. Both were bright, creative, and happy. This would be my shot at doing what I loved most, writing. When the carbon dioxide from my breath wafted by, the tick sprang to attention. It began waving its four-legged claws and snagged the skin of the passing mammal. In an instant, the glands below its claws began oozing a fatty, sticky substance that helped it hold onto my leg. Then it started crawling upward, its senses tuned to find a protected, blood-infused patch of skin. The tick found the perfect spot at the nape of my neck. hidden under my hair. The back legs elevated the tick's mouth parts at the perfect striking angle, and its three-part jaw telescoped down toward my skin. First, its top two cutting mouth parts gently scraped the surface while releasing a numbing agent. Then, by rocking its body back and forth, the tick began digging through my tough outer layer of skin, its bottom jaw shaped like a shovel and backed with harpoon barbs, slid into the hole to anchor the drilling operation. Once a feeding hole was established, the tick's salivary glands secreted chemicals into the wound site, a cement-like substance coated within a protein that made it invisible to my immune system, hardened into a funnel and anchored the jaws to the hole. As blood pooled at the bottom of the hole, the tick's throat muscles began pumping action. Saliva flowed out. My blood flowed in. Chemicals in the saliva included a clot-dissolving fluid and kept the wound from scabbing over, and others that suppressed my many immune system defenses. While this tick fed, it released into my bloodstream the microbial hitchhikers floating inside its body. Its salivary chemicals would blunt my immune defenses for a week or more, allowing these foreign invaders to multiply with little resistance. Over the next few days, the tick's body ballooned with blood. Its weight increased 100 plus times, and when the tick could hold no more, it dropped to the ground. I remained oblivious to the encounter. Another tick bit my husband. Both ticks would go on to molt or lay several thousand eggs, and the cycle would begin again, perhaps repeating for another million years. I waded back out of the sailboat, took a seat at the stern, and looked toward Martha's Vineyard, veiled in mist. It would be nice to have a writer's studio there, overlooking the sea. The wind picked up, and the ride across Vineyard Sound was bumpy. I felt a little nauseated. This was the beginning of our long journey to hell and back. Paul and I had been bitten by unseen ticks harboring an unknown number of disease-causing organisms. These tick bites would rob us of our good health and send me on an investigation into an almost unimaginable possibility. We were the collateral damage in a biological weapons race that had started during the Cold War. While the use of arthropod-borne biological weapons ended decades ago, really, arthropods include insects, crustaceans, and arachnids. The disease-causing microbes the bugs carried are still lurking in the soil, in the bloodstreams of animals, and most dangerously in ticks. Ticks, like tiny soldiers, keep marching outward from the epicenter of any bioweapons release, injecting their payloads into birds, beasts, and humans. No one is looking for these microbes in sick humans. There are no simple, accurate tests for them, and the microbes can hide deeply within a body's tissue, concealed from the immune system. Humans infected with more than one species of these microbes present with a confusing set of symptoms, not well described in the medical literature. The effects of these mutant microbes on the environment will be felt for decades. It is an American Chernobyl. Chapter 2, The Scientist. Hamilton, Montana, 1981. When we think of research that makes a difference, we often picture individuals whose particular discoveries marked watershed moments in scientific history. One such person made a substantial impact on biomedical science and human health was biologist Willy Berndorfer. from the Great Willy Bergdorfer 1925 to 2014, National Institute of Health blog post, February 2nd, 2015. On November 5th, 1981, Willy Bergdorfer, a 56-year-old Swiss-American scientist, picked up a black-legged deer tick with forceps and snipped off the tip of one of its legs. A small drop of tick blood called hemiolymph formed at the wound site, and Willy smeared it on a glass slide and slipped the slide under a microscope lens for viewing. Willy was working late at the Rocky Mountains laboratory, searching for the tick-borne microbe behind a mysterious illness that had been spreading across Connecticut and New York State in the 1970s. It started with flu-like symptoms: fever, malaise, fatigue, chills, headache, stiff neck, sore back, and muscle aches. Many of the afflicted had joint swelling that would come and go. About 20% of the Connecticut patients developed a red, expanding bullseye rash called Etheria migrans. Some patients went on to develop neurological and health problems. Researchers called the illness Lyme disease because the first set of human case studies were clustered in the rural area around the township of Lyme, Connecticut, suspiciously close to Fort Detrick and Plum Island. That evening, as Willy peered into the microscope's eyepiece, he was greeted with a surprising sight. A round worm of exceptional size filled the viewing area. He leaned back from the microscope to think. Never before had this type of roundworm been seen in a hard-bodied tick in the United States. Was it an accidental hitchhiker? Willy looked through a few more ticks and found another roundworm. Maybe the tick had picked it up after feeding on an infected rodent or deer? He pressed one of the ticks into the slab of clay and opened its belly with a scalpel. With Swiss watchmaker's tools, he gently extracted the tick's craggy midgut, shaped like a tiny glove, and smeared its contents onto a slide. Through the microscope, he saw something else unusual, faintly stained spirochetes, thread-like bacteria, some slightly coiled and some in messy clumps. He recognized them as Borrelia, the same bacterial genus as the African relapsing fever spirochetes. He studied as a student in Switzerland, and because he had read most of the early scientific literature on the organisms, he remembered that several European researchers suspected that spirochetes must cause a disease similar to the one that was being investigated around Lyme, Connecticut. This was Willy's aha moment. Next, he and his lab co-workers went through a rigorous process to prove that this microbe was the causative agent of Lyme disease. First, they isolated a few of the spirochetes and developed a nutrient-rich liquid that enabled them to grow the microbes in quantity. They then injected the cultured microbes into the healthy lab animals to see if they caused the same disease. 2 lab rabbits developed bullseye rashes similar to the ones found on Lyme disease patients. When the researchers analyzed blood from the newly infected lab animals and from Lyme disease patients from New York and Connecticut, they saw similar spirochetes. These experiments were checked and rechecked, a process that took 14 months. In June 1982, Science magazine published their discovery article, Lyme disease, a tick-borne spirochetosis, and and hundreds of scientists worldwide began looking for Lyme spirochetes in patients and in ticks. A year later, at the first International Symposium on Lyme disease, the spirochete was named after Willy Borrelia burgdorferi. The discovery of the organism that caused Lyme disease changed Willy's life forever. His schedule filled up with media interviews, investigations to scientific conferences, and worldwide queries on how to diagnose this emerging disease. Congratulations poured in from around the world. He received the Schauden-Hoffmann plaque in 1985 from the German Society Dermatologists, the Robert Koch Gold Medal 1988, the Bristol Award 1989 from the Infectious Disease Society of America, the IDSA, the Walter Reed Medal of 1990, and the American Society of Topical Medicine and Hygiene, and honorary degrees from the University of Bern, the University of Marseille, Montana State University, and Ohio State University. How did Willy discover the spirochete that so many other scientists had missed? Many of his colleagues attributed it to his dodged work ethic and his insistence on reading the historical papers of scientists who had come before him. Maybe it was dogged. Yeah, that was probably it. Many of his colleagues attributed it to his dogged work ethic and his insistence on reading the historical papers of scientists who had come before him. He knew that in 1909, a Swedish physician, Dr. Arvid Afzelius, had described a patient who developed a ring-like expanding rash after a tick bite. In 1948, Dr. Karl Lenhoff from the dermatologic clinic at the Karolinska Institute had infected spirochetes as a possible cause of a number of diseases with bullseye rashes and Lyme-like symptoms. And in 1949, Dr. Stephen Hellertrom from the Karolinska Institute suggested that the European castor bean tick, Isodes rhinichus, might transmit a microbe that caused an expanding rash and inflammation of the brain and spine in some patients. Willy's friend Stanley Falcow, PhD, a Stanford microbiologist, a pioneer in figuring out how microbes cause disease, attributed the findings to the tens of thousands of hours that Willy had spent looking at tick innards. He had very keen powers of observation, said Fallow. Willy called his discovery serendipity, a happy accident. While all the pieces of this public-facing story are true, they don't represent the whole truth. Shortly before his death, Willy was videotaped saying that he believes that the outbreak of tick-borne diseases that started around Lyme, Connecticut, had been caused by a bioweapons release. It was a stunning admission, but it could explain why the condition we call Lyme disease is so hard to diagnose and treat, and why the epidemic is spreading so far and so fast. If anyone else had said this, I might have walked away, but Willy was the person with the most to lose. When this information came to light, his legacy would be destroyed, and because of this horrible secret, the foundational science behind Lyme disease was compromised, and patients were being harmed. In the beginning, I pitched this story to a few mainstream journalists, but none of them would touch it. Willy's confession was too vague and fragmented because he was suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease. The investigation would be time-consuming, scientifically complex, and too reliant on a single cooperative whistleblower. Few scientists would jump at the chance to overturn the conventional view of Lyme disease. After all, their livelihoods depended on government grants and favorable peer reviews. Yet, if somebody didn't look into this, the secret would die with Willy. The better angel in me just couldn't let that happen. Yeah, we're only 25 minutes in. The Cold War. Chapter 3, Coin Toss. Basel, Switzerland, 1948. If I said I want that man, unless the Manhattan Project said they needed him, I got him. Ira L. Baldwin, PhD, first scientific director of the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories at Camp Detrick. Ira. In 1948, Professor Rudolf Geige showed Willy Bergdorfer, a 23-year-old PhD student at the Swiss Tropical Institute in Basel, an ordinary petri dish filled with sand. Willy, this dish holds about 20 Ornithodoros mobata, the eyeless tampon, said Geige, a pipe-smoking, hippo-shaped man who wore fine suits tailored to minimize his girth. Willy peered into the sand and saw nothing until Geige shook the dish. Suddenly the sand crawled to life with soft-bodied ticks. They looked like tiny, shriveled golden raisins with spidery black legs. Geige explained that in East Africa, these ticks bury themselves under the dirt floors of huts, patiently waiting for a blood meal. They spring to life when the scent organs in the tips of their front legs detect carbon dioxide from a nearby farm animal or human. Swiftly crawling into a sleeping victim, they sink their sawtooth mouthparts into a vein and suck in warm blood for a few minutes before dropping off. During the blood meal, the tick can transmit the two potentially deadly diseases that Geige was studying, relapsing fever and African swine fever. From Africa, Geige airmailed Willy the ticks he had collected from small villages. He was trying to find the locations of relapsing fever outbreaks. Within 24 hours, Willy could dissect these ticks under a microscope and then telegraph the results to Geige. This was the beginning of Willy's love affair with ticks. Willy, a handsome, square-jawed, boned blonde with a broad, gapped-toothed grin, grew up in Basel, Switzerland, the second son in a working-class family. His father, Karl Bergdorfer, was a police detective, and his mother, Mamsel, was a shopkeeper and a house cleaner. The family of four lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood near the Rhine River. The building was in an unadorned part of the city, on a street lined mostly with four-story structure housing retail shops on the ground floor and apartments above. Growing up, Willy was a member of the Harbor Gang, local boys who built hideouts and pretend gladiator arenas among the stacks of lumber and coal piled along the docks on the banks of the Rhine River. He and his friends were quick to start fights with the German kids who crossed the border over the railroad bridges. Willy was eager to please, but rough around the edges, speaking Swiss German in a booming voice. Willy's father was a hothead disciplinarian, a binge drinker, and a womanizer. Sometimes he'd go missing, telling his family he was on a secret assignment hunting down Nazi spies. One time, the police brought him home drunk with a bloodied face. He had been robbed and beaten outside a local bar. Later, Willy discovered that his father had a second family, a mistress and a child. Despite his many shortcomings, Willy's father desperately wanted a better life for his sons. In the Swiss educational system, candidates for the university were selected in the fourth year of elementary school. To get into the 8-year university preparatory school called gymnasium, students had to pass a tough oral and written exams. Father Bergdorfer bullied Willy's older brother into gymnasium first, but his poor grades resulted in probation and then a demotion to a lower track. After that disappointment, the father's ambitions turned to Willy. At least one of my boys should have a better education than I had, he said. I want you to make something of yourself. Go to the university and become a teacher, doctor, or chemist, something I can be proud of. Willy knew that he didn't have good enough grades to get into gymnasium, but his father made him fill out an entrance application Anyway, a few days later, Willy's teacher called him into his office and said, "Impossible, quite impossible," with polite laughter he added. "Really, you will never make it. I better have a chat with your parents to save you from future humiliation." Before he left that day, Willy called into the principal's office to pick up a sealed letter to deliver to his parents. After dinner, his father ceremoniously opened the teacher's envelope and read the typewritten note. Everyone held their breath and locked their eyes on the family patriarch as he read each line, bracing for the inevitable explosion of rage. Instead, Carl placed the letter on the table, turned to Willy, and gently said, "Well, really, I guess you will have to show them they are wrong. If you are willing to try your best, you will make it." Willy's family made sacrifices to keep him. Willy's family made sacrifices to help him move up the university track. His wealthier classmates often reminded him of his low social status, commenting on his coarse German cheap suits and inability to play piano, violin, or cello. To help Willy focus on his studies, his parents placed a desk and a lamp in the corner of their bedroom where he could study. They forced him to quit soccer, wrestling, and rifle competitions, and pressured him to decline social invitations with friends. As for Willy, to make extra money for books and school supplies, he sold white mice to nearby research laboratories, setting up cages in the family bathroom, on the balcony, and in the cellar. Bergdorfer mice were raised on milk-soaked bread and oat flakes, Willy said. I gained a reputation for delivering top-quality product. 8 years later, against all odds, Willy was accepted into the University of Basel, where he started the doctoral program on parasitology, hemianthology, the study of worms, a tropical bacteriology. Willy's academic advisor, Rudolf Geige, was born in 1902 to a wealthy upper-class family that founded what would become J.R. Geige AG, a chemical company that started as a family business in 1758. The company's Basel headquarters were on the Rhine River, in the region where the borders of Switzerland, France, and Germany meet. During World War II, the company was perfectly situated to sell goods to both Allies and Germany. The original Geige company started off as a textile dye manufacturer and then moved into chemicals. During the war, it produced insecticides and most notably the iconic polar red dye that colored the background of Nazi swastika flags. Early in life, Geige opted for the adventure and jungle helmet over a traditional position in the family's firm. With the help of his family's wealth, he dedicated his life to minimizing the human toll of tropical diseases. many of which were transmitted by arthropods. To support his mission, he established the Swiss Tropical Institute Field Laboratory in Tanganyika, part of present-day Tanzania. In 1949, the Centre Suisse de Recherche Scientifique in Corte d'Ivoire in 1951. Even during the war, his citizenship in a neutral country enabled him to travel freely. The Swiss are above suspicion, said Geigy, who later in life wrote a thinly fictionalized novel, Siri, Top Secret, that describes the spy activities he observed during his travels. It's not known if Geigy participated in these activities, but he did help place young researchers in institutions that supported the United States bioweapons program. Geigy often lectured to university students about his adventures in exotic locations as he unraveled the mysteries of tropical diseases. He described a boat ride on Lake Naivasha in Kenya, where thousands of flamingos decorated the lakeshore like a pink ribbon. He showed the students pictures of the terns, frigate birds, herons, and giant turtles, and of the Seychelles, an archipelago country in the Indian Ocean. He told them about the red-beaked oxpecker performed bold and agile gymnastics on buffaloes, giraffes, and elephants in order to catch flies and ticks. Near the end of his undergraduate study, Willy was enamored with the promise of such a career, and he applied for a research position in Geigy's institute. He wanted to rise above his humble beginnings, and he saw Geigy's prestigious institute as the way to do it. Willy's mission for the next 2.5 years was to learn under Geigy's supervision everything he could about soft-bodied ticks and the parasites that lived within them. At the time, Geigy's research was focused on the corkscrew-shaped spirochete bacterium Borrelia dutoni, which causes African relapsing fever. With this particular relapsing fever, the infected suffer from roughly 3-day episodes of high fever, headache, muscle and joint aches, and nausea. After a few days of normalcy, the pattern repeats many times, sometimes leading to death. This early experience with spirochetes laid the foundation for Willy's Lyme spirochete discovery decades later. In these days, as a student researcher, Willy became familiar with the work of experts who studied parasites in ticks and humans. Professor Geigy would travel for months to Africa to gather ticks and tissue samples from wildlife. He was most interested in finding villages that were harboring soft ticks, carrying spirochetes. After collecting tick samples from the crevices and the dirt floors of native huts inhabited by people with relapsing fever, he airmailed them to Willy so he could research their tissues for Borrelia. At first, Willy couldn't keep up with Geigy's demands for tick dissections. His initial technique was laborious, requiring him to place each tick on a work surface and using precision eye surgery scalpels and Swiss watchmaker forceps, slice open its exoskeleton from head to tail. Once the tick was filtered, he could extract its organs and view them under a microscope, searching for the spaghetti-like tangles of relapsing fever spirochetes. This approach required that Willy work through the night so he could telegraph his results to Professor Geigy in the morning. It was during this period that he came up with a faster technique, snipping off the tip of one of the tick's legs and collecting a drop of the tick's hemolymph to put on a microscope slide for examination. This was as accurate as surgery for detecting microorganisms in the tick, but significantly more efficient. After 3 years, Willy completed his dissertation on the African relapsing fever spirochete Borrelia dutoni and its tick host, Ornithodoros mobata. In his thesis, he describes the tick's mechanisms for transmitting spirochetes to animal hosts. This was the first chapter in Willy's work with Borrelia. At the end of Willy's training, Geigy pulled him and another student aside to tell them about two choice postdoctoral research positions available abroad. One, clearly the plum job, was in Sardinia, Italy. It held the promise of warm beaches and Italian food. The position would require the testing of Geigy's company, new insecticide for killing mosquitoes called diphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT. The other job was working for the United States Public Health Service at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory in Hamilton, Montana. The lab creator, Carl Larson, needed a medical zoologist who knew how to work with ticks, fleas, mites, and mosquitoes. The Montana job was in the middle of nowhere, in a small cowboy town that had built a laboratory to investigate a deadly tick-borne disease discovered there in the late 1800s, known by locals as black measles, tick fever, or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Scientists called the tiny bacterium that caused this disease Rickettsia. It was transmitted by tick bites. Both young men, of course, wanted the Italian job, so Professor Geigy pulled out a Swiss franc coin and suggested they flip for it. The coin was embossed on one side with the braided armor warrior goddess of Switzerland, Helvetia. Willy called heads, and Geigy flipped the coin into the air, and at the precise moment in space and time, that coin landed on the goddess Helvetia and turned her face downward, and Willy lost. He wasn't going to Italy. Okay, we'll pick this up tomorrow.